Did the Canadian government, did the federal Liberals use a psychological operation to unethically manipulate public opinion in the 2025 spring federal election? That's a question that arises in many people's minds this week with the release of a new report from the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. The report is titled Manufacturing Consent, Government Behavioural Engineering of Canadians. Now, I'm going to read you just a sentence or two here. It's authored by veteran journalist and researcher Nigel Hannaford. The report warns that the federal government has embedded behavioral science tactics in its operations in order to shape Canadians' beliefs, emotions, and behaviors, all without transparency, without debate, and without consent. The report details how the Impact and Innovation Units, the IIU, in Ottawa is increasingly using sophisticated behavioral psychology such as nudge theory and other message tools to influence the behavior of the Canadian public. And today, in my fifth installment of the Genius Model of Social Contagion, I'm going to explore in a broader context some of the tactics of mass manipulation that have been evolving and we might even say nearly perfected in the age of social media and targeted messaging. My name is Shannon Boucher. This is the Canadian Culture Wars Report. I'm your host, and stay tuned for some thought-provoking and frightening ideas about how the public may be influenced unduly by our government. Now, I've put forward a model, the Genius Model of Social Contagion. And in my second video, the first real video, I dove into the nature of social contagion and social coherence in human terms. And I pointed to that this being is the default state. Human beings are social animals. We are tribal creatures, and group identity and group coherence is the default state of human beings. We are in much larger civilizations than we evolved in. We evolved in groups that are sometimes referred to as Dunbar groups or the Dunbar threshold, between 50 and 150 people. And those groups maintained a social coherence. Many parallels to primate communities. There's a terrific documentary right now on Netflix called, what's it called? Chimp Empire. My wife just loved this. It's a 4 or 5 part documentary on the largest chimpanzee troop in the world and you can see it if you watch it, you can see how social coherence is maintained, but also what happens in the face of threat to the troop and how the troop organizes itself in a coherent way to combat and defend against enemies. We're more sophisticated, obviously, than chimpanzees, but when we drill down, we can see group coherence phenomena all across the animal kingdom. We've got bees and ants and termites, and we've got fish balls, and we've got herds of elephants, and we've got wolf packs, and we've got pods of whales and dolphins. And all of these groups have social structures that bind them together, okay? So then I went on to talk a little bit about what I refer to as the genius. Now, the genius isn't a new model either. It goes back thousands of years. It's a Roman term. The genius was a personification, my argument here, and not the Romans' argument, but I believe that it was a representation or a model or a symbol, a anthropomorphization of a set of cognitive functions, unconscious that we have, that the Romans personified as kind of a spirit guide or a spirit companion. And the Greeks before them called it a daimon or a daemon. It was the word and language was kind of evolved. The Persians called it a jinn or a spirit. We see representations of a spirit guide or a totem animal or a companion spirit, guardian angel all around the world. It's a personification of a brain function. And one of the personifications that comes up consistently is either of a young child or even a dog or a canine companion, essentially that extends our senses outwards into the world. The genius or the daimon or this companion spirit is a representation of brain functions that we understand today. The reticular activation system, reticular formation system, part of a midbrain decision-making triangle or an extension connected with the amygdala that helps us assemble a model of reality or a map of the world. And what I haven't talked about so far is how the genius or how the reticular formation system engages with the world and what its language is. So it doesn't speak in words. We can't have a specific dialogue with the inner daemon. It's less formal than that. It operates on emotions. It operates on symbols and images, and it operates on salience. And broadly, salience is, can I eat it? Can I screw it? Will it kill me? And that's at a base level. So we have this brain function, reticular formation system, that operates on unconsciously based on emotions and symbols, and can as such be influenced by emotions and symbols. It's the part of you that's responsible for scanning your environment constantly. If we were in a Dunbar group in more traditional human society, we would always kind of be on alert, aware for sounds or indications of predators in our environment. And we've always got this unconscious part of us that's going to draw our attention, that called an orienting response to threats and potential danger. Okay. So this part of us operates, as I said, images, symbols, emotions, a simple kind of language. And it is what is the conduit to the unconscious mind and how we make decisions even. So I've spent, I'm fairly to say, I've spent 25 years in sales. It's more like 35 years, but 25 of it certainly in professional sales. And one of the things, if you work in the industry of sales, that you come to learn very quickly in sales training and professional development is that people don't make decisions based on logic and rationality. Perhaps engineers do, perhaps some people who sit somewhere on the autistic spectrum do, but it's not data that drives decisions in human beings, it's emotions. And there are 5 very contagious emotions. This is what kind of would jack your reticular activating system, would light up your spirit guide, get its attention, and therefore draw you into these things. And we deal with this stuff every single day in the digital environment. We deal with viral memes, news stories, things that grab our attention, and you can see how they get collective pickup based on this emotion. So high arousal, positive emotions are awe, excitement, and amusement and humor. High arousal, negative emotions are anger and anxiety. And I'm going to add in there, under the umbrella of anger is fear, is a response to threat, is resentment, what Nietzsche called ressentiment. It's a position of jealousy or envy. A number of these, we can think of them too, and I've mentioned this before, is the 7 deadly sins are deeply emotionally contagious kinds of ideas. Greed is a highly contagious human emotion. It's responsible for stock market bubbles and economic booms and implosions, gold rushes, and fishing wars and gambling addiction. So these can be so capturing to human minds that we become fixated on them. And we can not only become fixated on them as individuals, but fixated on them in groups. We actually get a coherence. So what is the difference in the domain of sales between ethical persuasion and manipulation? Now, in my early professional sales career, I worked on a retail, high-ticket retail sales floor, or in a sales business. And there were people in a transactional environment, salespeople, that will exploit others to make the deal, to make the commission. They will use almost a psychopathological view of others as objects, exploit them in order to make money, and have a low regard or low esteem for the needs and outcomes of the person that they're providing a product or service to. I've seen this over and over and over again in my career. It was very disturbing to me in these transactional environments to see people getting manipulated, like selling little old ladies $15,000 computers in 1998 when they really wanted to just play solitaire. And could have gotten away with a $1,500 or $2,000 version. We hear unfortunate stories about that all the time. In the used car business, for example, has a very bad reputation. So what about this nudge unit? Okay, so in the 1930s, we had, of course, the famous quote when we think of Nazi Germany of Goebbels saying, "Repeat a lie, the big lie, repeat it enough times that people are going to believe it." But it's deeper than that. The lie has to be emotional and has to have a significant emotional contingent to it. So back in 2020, 2021, during the early years of the first years of the pandemic, people were elevated. Their affect, their emotional intensity was high, and fear was high, and anxiety was high, and it was lit up a collective kind of protective mindset. And in that state, people become highly, highly suggestible. So fear is this motivator. Now, what about this nudge unit? Because it appears that the liberal government exploited the exploited public fear with a false narrative, lies, in order to win the election. So I'm pointing to what began kind of as a joke or a trolling or almost a paternalistic, gotcha, when Justin Trudeau complained to Donald Trump when he was at Mar-a-Lago that, Canada can't afford that, or that would harm Canada in some way. And Trump responded almost in a dad joke to say, well, you could become the 51st state. Well, that became the weaponized narrative that threaded through the Liberal election campaign. And the Liberals were set to lose. We were on track for a Conservative majority government. And we were at a point where we have a government with an embedded nudge unit, an embedded psychological operations unit, much like the Brits have. And it had already been tested during COVID in order to persuade and manipulate the public into uptake on the vaccine. And there's a couple layers of that. This is called the Impacts and Innovations Unit, is currently headed, I'm understanding, by Theresa Tam. So if you've been following the vaccine stuff, that is who is managing the nudge unit in Canada right now. But with these tools and technology available, it is a troubling thing to see it deployed by the party in power to maintain power. So we've got a troop of chimps, a large troop, 100 or so members of the troop, give or take. And you've got a young male, perhaps a couple of young males, and they're exploring the boundaries of the chimp troop. And they get a scent and a sound of the enemy troop, and they vocalize. They start shaking some trees. They send messages back to the entire troop, whose collective affect goes up, their emotional intensity goes up. And that galvanizes emotionally, I might use the term energetically or affectively, the troop of chimps. And the warrior class of males galvanize towards the battle, and the females move towards protecting the children. Obviously, they'll fight if they have to, but their response is protection. So when we get a signal like this that we're in danger, that our society is in danger, that our troop is in danger, we have an automatic protective instinct. The emotional affect goes up. The cognitive capacity actually goes way down. We move deeply into what's called a sympathetic nervous response, where it's part of the fight or flight system, where we get tunnel vision. And in that tunnel vision, in response to danger, we will galvanize our focus on one object, the object of danger, and we will shut out all other information. So this is why I was hearing over and over again when talking to people about their parents who just could not have a conversation. There was no rationality. There was no reason. There was no capacity you could put clear information to the contrary directly in front of people, but because they had been cognitively hijacked, genius jacked, that their orienting sensory system had been entirely focused on a danger, and that there was collective uptake, which is social proof and confirms for people, whether the drivers of that are true or not, that they're on the right side of the particular battle. This cognitive narrowing, this shift into what's called the sympathetic nervous system response, and this tunnel vision that happens when we are under stress and have shifted into a fear coherence or an anger coherence, or one of those big socially contagious coherences that leads to things like mass psychosis and pathological group formation, is also what leads us to what has been pointed out many, many times in the literature, is that people are reduced to very, very simple sloganeering, where they can't frame anything outside of those slogans. And ironically, one of the big criticisms from the Liberal election campaign, and coming from the Liberal Party's apparatus, was that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives trafficked in nothing but slogans, which is a lie, but an easily digestible lie for the people who are caught up in the elbows up hysteria, 51st state narrative. And we're playing in their own game of slogans. Elbows up, 51st state, Trump wants to own us. He wants to take our land. He wants to take our water. He wants our country. He wants all of those things triggered existential threat. Existential meaning life or death threat and the social coherence that corresponded to that. So sloganeering is one of the symptoms, especially rigid sloganeering is one of the symptoms of mass psychosis. And in the case of nudge units, it's a symptom that the unethical mass manipulation of the public is working. Now, no one's ever going to cop to using psychological warfare on our own population because it's so deeply unethical. And we can see that these units have been used in the past in other countries and are having more and more uptake. It raises the question about the very nature of our democracy when the government in power can make you, instead of being in power because of the will of the people is manufactured to keep the people in power and to give them even more power. And as this snowballs and accelerates, we empower authoritarian, strong people to come and rescue us from the hypothetical, or in the case of the elbows up, hysteria, mass contagion, to maintain the people in power. It's still going on. The residual from elbows up is still going on. People have been poisoned by this. This kind of reality distortion field, which is another way of talking about this, is an authoritarian tactic to create a false reality, a false image of self, and a false reality that people are gaslit into participating in. And it behaves exactly at scale the way an authoritarian or abusive family does at a small scale, at a microcosm. So I talked about this in my last video when I was talking about temperament, personality types, toxic family systems, and internal cognitive structures that we have that unfortunately make us vulnerable to these kinds of things. And just a refresher, we have the authoritarian. In the case of a personality disordered individual at the head of a family, they manufacture a reality distortion field. They create a false image for the world that they want to maintain for the family, and they use kind of family coercion and participation to enforce it. So this is where the golden child image comes in, because the golden child is propped up as part of the image of the family. At scale, we have golden groups. We have the marginalized that we have to protect, and we have the vulnerable and special. And then there's the scapegoat. So if you've got an enemy, you got to have someone to blame for it. And if you've got people who are whistleblowers or truth tellers who are calling into question the reality distortion field, they become the targets of the authoritarian, because you cannot have a narrative, you cannot have a story, you cannot have information that contradicts the authoritarian manipulator, preventing them from getting what they want. So those people become the enemy. They become the truckers, they become the scapegoats, they become the objects of animosity. And then you've got the victims of this. You have the people who suffer as a consequence of this manipulation. The actual victims, not the special people, not the marginalized, not the poor victims, but you actually have the people who are suffering from it. Those people become the lost child. They become the rejected cohorts that are acting out in some way because of the toxicity of the system. So the genius, despite this notion of, as I've described it, it's a spirit guide, a spirit companion, that's been personified for us in cultures around the world all through time, isn't a magical guardian angel. It's actually a part of what is consistently personified in this brain function or the structure in the mythic traditions, is that it's a trickster spirit. The manifestation in cartoons and comic books and stories of an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other shoulder is a good exemplar of this. The reticular formation system is actually both of those things, and that it is our conscious choice that determines what path we go down, right or wrong. The grand archetype of Christ, the other side of it, is the devil, the angel, the devil figure. In Egyptian mythology, it's Osiris and his brother Set. In Norse mythology, it's Thor and Loki. In other traditions, it's simpler in some ways, but more sophisticated in others, in the sense that it's recognized that the individual spirit itself has both capacities. It's the trickster. So Hermes is a trickster, Mercury is a trickster and a shapeshifter, and can deceive us if we're not careful with it. We have to be aware that this part of us can be deceived and can get us into trouble and act as a trickster in our lives. So this has been episode 5 of the Genius Model of Social Contagion. I wanted to bring it into current events to share with you how this part of us, this trickster figure, this genius, this daemon, is a part of our everyday lives, and how it can be weaponized and used against us when authorities who have accumulated the knowledge of how the collective mind works exploits those emotions that make us vulnerable to manipulation instead of ethical persuasion. My name is Shannon Boucher. This is a Canadian Culture Wars Report special series, The Genius Model of Social Contagion. I hope this broadened out some of the thinking and reflection that you may have around this issue, this question. And you may wonder, as I've said before, it's good to wonder about these things, because if you're engaging in internal dialogue or internal exploration, you may notice how this part of you guides you and can be weaponized against you. Now, next week on The Genius Model of Social Contagion, episode 6, or the 6th installment, I'm going to talk about hierarchies, social hierarchies, and how the genius fits into the social frameworks that we're wired to participate in as human beings, and why it is that the genius will often plug people into systems within a hierarchy rather than act as an independent spirit guide for an individuated person to navigate life with agency and autonomy of their own.